Hello and welcome to another episode of the Bible Speaks podcast. I am Brian.
And I'm Daniel.
And we want to introduce today's episode. Today's episode will be dealing with an event that happened on November 30th of 2021 at the Oxford High School in Michigan, where a 15-year-old male student brought a semi-automatic handgun to that school and began to open fire, killing 4 students and injuring 7 others, including 1 teacher.
Yeah, so we want to discuss the events that preceded this shooting, as they're important to what we'll be discussing later in the episode. First, there's a couple things that I couldn't really find a clear timeline, but they kind of establish his character traits. Apparently, he was... one news article put it fascinated with Nazi propaganda.
What does that mean, Daniel? Is there any expansion on that?
Yeah, he apparently kept a Nazi coin in plain view in his bedroom and even went as far as drawing Nazi symbols in a notebook that the family used to make their grocery lists.
You know what's sad about that? You're talking about the swastika, right?
It just said Nazi symbol. I'm assuming it's a swastika because I can't really think of any other except for like that eagle one.
Oh yeah, that's true. You know, it's a shame that was ruined by Hitler in Germany, because that used to stand for the sun in Chinese history. The sun. Yeah, it was a source of power, I think, and I believe that's why Hitler adopted it. But ever since World War II, ever since the Nazi regime, obviously it's been something that invokes hatred.
Yeah, I've actually heard that before.
Yeah.
There were other instances that have come out in court and in depositions. Apparently, he had repeatedly told his mother in text messages that he thought there was a demon or a ghost or someone else inside the home. And also, allegedly, kept a bird head in a jar.
That seems odd.
Right?
Yeah,
at least cause for some kind of alarm already, right?
And what did the text? Did they say what the text said?
No, the article I was reading didn't get into the specifics of like actual quotations of text messages. They just said that there were multiple instances where he told his mom he thought there was someone or something in the house.
Boy, I don't want to. We didn't make this podcast about this topic, but that talks into like demon.
Oh, angels and demons. And
yeah,
stuff
man.
like that. Maybe that's a topic for a future episode.
Something we should maybe look into. Yeah.
Yeah. And now, to be clear, these things, as far as I can tell, no one involved in the case, as far as school staff, were aware of these issues until after the attack.
I had also read that he was displaying an interest in violence. Is that something else that had come out?
Yeah, so that's actually my next point. We moved to August of 2021. Actually, no, that would be September. So I'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
In August of 2021, one teacher said that he drew what looked like a magazine, an ammunition magazine for a gun, on a note card. Unfortunately, the teacher who found that note said in her deposition she didn't see it until the day before the shooting.
I mean, is that something at this point? I guess if you know his text messages, but if kids are drawing ammunition magazines, is that something that I guess in today's day and age, right? It would cause red flags. But man, when I was growing up, that just wasn't a thing.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. Like to me, I guess not that big a deal, but with the prevalence of school shootings and, just kind of the environment we live in now, it's probably at least cause for some level of alarm for the teacher, right?
Yeah, so they should at least notify somebody, right?
Yeah. And then also in August of 2021, he made a video using a different gun, not the one that he used in the shooting. But he made a video with this other gun and told a friend of his that he sent it to in a message, number one, that he had access to the gun, and then also, I'm quoting here, "Time to shoot up the school. JK, JK, JK."
Oh, wow. See, that's a huge red flag.
Right?
Yeah. And the fact that he even has access to guns at that point is alarming.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with that. And we'll probably talk about that more as far as securing firearms later in this episode.
Yeah, good idea.
It's unclear if the parents, the school, or law enforcement were ever made aware of this video before the shooting happened.
What was it, on social media or something? Or did he just send it via text or whatever?
I think he sent it via text. I'm not sure. He may have sent it in like a direct message on social media.
Okay.
The article wasn't clear about what medium he used to send the message.
So not sure if everybody was aware of that.
Yeah. And then, here is the evidence, or what speaks to him being interested in violence. He responded in a survey at school that, and this was all in August, that one of his favorite books was a book called Making Bombs for Hitler. I don't know anything about that book. I didn't bother to really look into it because it didn't sound like something I wanted to look into.
Yeah, and we don't recommend anybody do look into that.
No, we don't. And he also responded that in that survey, among his favorite TV shows were Breaking Bad and Dexter.
I mean, those are popular TV shows regardless, right?
They are popular, and I'm not saying that if you like these episodes, you clearly are fascinated with violence and want to commit acts of violence. But given his other proclivities, I guess it's a bit alarming.
Yeah, especially if he's making videos talking about shooting up the school. You know, what is the premise of that Dexter show? It's a serial killer, isn't it?
I guess so. I've never really... I think I've seen maybe one episode like years and years and years ago. I know he kills people. Yeah,
I've never seen it. You know, it's interesting. This always brings up the question of what came first, right? The motives or the suggestion, right? The suggestion being the entertainment or the motives of the person watching it. You know, that's another topic we can maybe look at some other time.
Yeah. Then we move on to September of 2021, about a month, maybe 6 weeks before the shooting. He wrote in a poem for his Spanish class that, quote, he feels terrible and that his family is a mistake. Now, the teacher, when she read this, or he or she, I'm not sure which one it was, the teacher sent an email asking a counselor to get in touch with him, or to touch base with him after reading this poem, but apparently the counselor never replied to that email.
Oh, wow. So there was an attempt to notify, but nothing was done.
Yeah, at that point. And then we get to 4 days before the shooting. His father actually brought the shooter with him to a gun store for Black Friday and bought his son the handgun he ended up using in the shooting as a what his mother referred to as a Christmas present for him.
Right, and that I did read up on that a little bit, and that is a violation of Michigan law, right, or federal law.
Yeah, it is a violation of federal law. According to Title 18 of the U.S. Code, a person must be at least 21 years old to own or purchase a handgun or handgun ammunition.
Yeah, and so the loophole there, right, was that the dad bought it for him.
Yeah, he used his son's money, but bought it as a present for him.
Wow. I wonder if we don't know the answer to this, but I wonder if the dad was aware of like the video he had sent or previously.
I don't know. As far as I could tell, when I was reading about that video he sent, only the friend or fellow student that he sent it to was aware.
So many red flags, so many mistakes are being made
already, right?
Yeah.
I think I want to talk about this a little bit later, but I'll go ahead and mention it here. Michigan doesn't have any sort of laws regarding secure storage of firearms.
They don't yet. I think there's actually some bills on the table that are going to be voted on here pretty soon.
There are, yeah, and they were drafted in response to this shooting.
Wow.
And I think one other one.
Yeah, there was a shooting at a university in Michigan as well.
Yeah, that one just happened a few weeks ago, I believe.
Too many, absolutely. But the reason I bring that up is that it has come out in court proceedings that the gun was kept like in a drawer in the parents' bedroom. So not a locked drawer.
Not a locked drawer. So he literally just walked in there and grabbed it, and the parents didn't even know until...
This was the gun that he used in the shooting?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that was 4 days before the shooting, and now we are up to the day before. One of the student's teachers saw him looking at ammunition for sale on his phone while in class. And again, the reason I bring that up is because, number one, according to federal law, Title 18 of the U.S. Code, you have to be at least 21 years old to buy handguns or their ammunition. And also in that same code, you have to be 18 years or older to buy rifles or shotguns and their ammunition.
Yeah, I just want to make a point really quick before we go any further that neither you nor I are taking a position on firearms or the use or ownership of firearms at this point, right? We just see these as alarming red flags in this particular story.
Yeah, I'm gonna do my best to not take one side or the other. I'm just explaining what the laws are and why this would be alarming if you were a teacher who saw this.
Yeah.
So the kid was 15 years old when the teacher caught him. When he committed the shooting. This was the day before. 15 years old, looking at ammunition for sale on his phone in class. That's a big red flag, right?
Well, especially in conjunction with everything that's happened up to this point.
Yeah. So he was not someone who was legally old enough to even buy ammunition anywhere in the country.
Yeah, again, I think it has to do with the fact that it's in conjunction with everything else. Because I know people who, and even young people who are looking, at ammunition as something for hunting or for practice or whatever with their parents in a lawful way. But obviously this person was not doing that.
Yeah, and I mean there are even it's fairly popular for young children to be involved with like shooting sports, like shooting competitions.
Right,
and
I've
stuff.
seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, this alone isn't reason for alarm, but like you said, in conjunction with everything else that's happened up to this point, it's a red flag. Now, after the teacher saw this, she did make her superiors aware, and they left a voicemail with his parents regarding this. They didn't reply to the school officials to that voicemail, but his mother, however, did send her son a text message saying, quote, "LOL, I'm not mad at you. You have to learn not to get caught."
Interesting. So the parents, at least at this point, both of them are complicit in what's leading up to the event.
Yeah, I don't think they realized how sick their son was at this point.
Yeah, and we're talking about like mental illness, not just regular physical illness. But this is, so I didn't realize that they didn't respond to the voicemail, because it was my understanding the parents did come to the school the day of.
They did go to the school the day of. That was because there was a very disturbing drawing that had been discovered. That note card that I mentioned earlier. Before I get to that, though, this came out in court, so this was not known before he committed the shooting.
When you say this, what are you referring to?
The night before the shooting, he recorded a video in which he discussed killing students.
Did he distribute that video?
It doesn't appear so. Again, because this is an ongoing case, it's kind of hard to find like consistent details. As far as I can tell, that was brought up in court by the sheriff, I think, of that county.
So they discovered it afterward.
Yeah, they. I'm assuming they seized his phone as evidence, and they discovered that video on the phone.
Okay.
It's unclear if he distributed that video.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so now we get to the morning of the shooting. The parents were summoned to the school, like Brian said, because one of his teachers discovered that note card with some very disturbing drawings on it. That note card included a drawing of a handgun pointed at the words, "The thoughts won't stop, help me."
Wow.
It also had a drawing of a bullet with the words "blood everywhere" written above the bullet.
So this is weird. It seems to me like this person is actually crying for help.
He was. I don't have it in my notes here, but I remember reading. He sent a text or something saying that I'm not getting the help I need, and they're going to make me shoot up the expletive school. They
probably being his parents or his family or whoever it was, or maybe even the image, right? The image of the ghost or whatever it was that he was seeing before. Who knows what he was referring to?
I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, that's possible. Like voices in his head or something.
Yeah.
On that note card also had a drawing of a person who appeared to have been shot twice and was bleeding. there was a drawing of a laughing emoji and writing that said, "My life is useless and the world is dead."
And these were all discovered the morning of?
The morning of the shooting.
Wow.
Yeah. So his parents were summoned to the school, confronted with these drawings, and they refused to take him home.
Yeah, that's what all the articles are saying is that they're using the word refuse. We don't know the details of that conversation. We weren't, fly on the wall, but from everything that we're being told by the media, they were actually refused to remove their child from the school that day.
Yeah, and I appreciate you making that point. We don't know what was said in that meeting. I've seen reported in multiple different news articles that it lasted 13 minutes. So I don't know,
Oh, the meeting itself?
Yeah,
Oh.
that meeting with school officials and the parents and the student. 13 minutes. They showed him these drawings. I'm sure that the officials requested that they remove him from school, but the parents refused. And they also, they being the school officials, told the parents they needed to get him into counseling within 48 hours.
That's such an interesting time frame. I mean, they probably maybe protocol or they're just best practice, but that's such an interesting 48 hours. I mean, I wonder why that was important.
Yeah, it's a bit arbitrary, right? I'm sure, like you said, there's some sort of protocol that they have to follow there.
And I mean, obviously, we would conclude that he needed counseling far before this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just with the things that we've discussed so far, and then this discovery of this drawing. I mean, I don't know how you feel, Brian, but if I had a child and I discovered they made a drawing like that, I would be like, okay, get in the car. We're going to find you a counselor right now because there's something wrong, and I want to get you help. Right?
Yeah. I mean, so many things have. I'll be honest. If I saw my child enjoying Nazi paraphernalia, that alone would at least open up conversations.
Yeah, right. Like you'd be like, okay, look, we need to sit down and talk about what these symbols mean. Right?
Yeah. What do they mean? What do they mean to you? Why are you so fascinated with them? Things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so after this meeting, the parents refused to take him home, and he was allowed to return to class. And unbeknownst to everyone in the room, he actually had that handgun that his dad bought him 4 days earlier in his backpack with a box of bullets.
Yeah, well, it seems like, nobody actually thought that he would go through with something like this, at least not the parents and the school officials.
No, they didn't. And that actually is made clear in the timeline of events as far as what happened immediately following the shooting. But before we get into that, 3 hours after this meeting, he goes into a bathroom with his backpack and comes out without his backpack, but instead with the handgun, and just starts taking aim at students in the hallway and in classrooms. And unfortunately, he ended up killing four students and wounded 6 others and 1 teacher.
Yeah, and as with all mass shootings, this is a tragedy.
Yeah. So now we move on to the aftermath of this shooting.
Yeah, just before we move on really quick, I want to just mention something that I had discovered is that there's still actually no official timeline of the shooting, which is kind of why we breezed over that event, is because there's been no release of an official timeline. The local law enforcement is citing pending criminal cases, which is why they cannot release the timeline due to evidence issues.
That's interesting because I actually found a CNN timeline with a CNN article with a rough timeline.
I saw that too. It's a rough timeline, but it is not an official timeline. And actually, the parents of the victims are demanding a timeline, but they're not getting one.
And understandably so, right?
Yeah, at this point, so early on, especially because of, as we'll talk about soon, because of the condition and situation of where the parents are and even where the shooter himself is.
Yeah. So real quick, I kind of want to just breeze over that timeline just because I want to make the point that he was arrested very quickly. It wasn't like the Uvalde shooting where he was just able to
right. The law enforcement got in there right away.
Yeah, he was arrested very quickly. According to that CNN article, he began shooting around 12:51, and he was active for less than 10 minutes from what I can tell. Officers were dispatched less than a minute later because immediately people were calling 911. They arrived at the school within 5 minutes and took him into custody within 3 minutes of their arrival.
Wow, that's just well done.
Absolutely.
Law enforcement.
I commend those police officers, way to get in there and stop the loss of life in there.
Absolutely.
And then this was very interesting to me. The parents' immediate reaction at around 1:15, so less than 30 minutes after this has happened, news reports started coming out that there had been a shooting at the high school. And at 1:22, his mom sent him a text saying, "Don't do it," according to prosecutors. And then at 1:37, prosecutors say that his father called 911 to report that a gun was missing from his house and that he believed his son may be the shooter.
So, I don't want to jump to too many conclusions, but it sounds like the parents discovered the missing gun and realized that something was wrong.
Yeah. I don't want to say I know what they were thinking, but after seeing those drawings and then, 3-4 hours later hearing about a shooting at the school, I can't imagine what they were feeling,
Yeah, and I just want to recommend that, if we do see troubling behavior in individuals, then we really do need to take action. We need to do something about it because this kind of stuff does happen.
Absolutely. And as we see, unfortunately, in our country, this happens far too often, right?
Right.
So in today's day and age, I don't know why you would not act on these things, So initially, the shooter's legal defense was pursuing an insanity plea, not guilty by reason of insanity. But as far as I can tell, they realized that the court was not going to find him mentally insane at the time of the shooting. And so they have since dropped that. And he ended up actually pleading guilty to all 24 charges against him last October.
Yeah, and those charges included charges of terrorism and first-degree murder. Yeah,
which from what I understand, this may be the first time that a school shooter has been even charged with terrorism.
Yeah, it's what's termed as domestic terrorism.
Yeah. And while those charges were being read, he affirmed that he, quote, knowingly, willfully, and deliberately chose to shoot other students.
So he's going to be sentenced based on pleading guilty.
Yeah. So yeah, he pled guilty to all 24 charges levied against him, and I'm glad this is happening. He's actually being charged as an adult in this case.
Oh right, yeah, because he's 16 now, but he's being charged as an adult.
Yeah. So after that, he pled guilty. A recent development is that a judge has actually ruled that the Oxford school staff are immune from civil lawsuits with regard to this case based on something called governmental immunity.
Yeah, and governmental immunity is it's a complicated idea based on a lot of legalese.
I noticed that too.
Yeah, but I kind of tried to sum up what it means in more layman's terms. Hopefully I do a little bit of justice here, but basically an institution or the members thereof cannot be held liable for conducting a public duty to protect the general population, and in this case it would be the student population and the staff in the school. They can't be held guilty where the government institution used due care to avoid increasing harm, and that's why we've spent so much time going over the timeline and what happened.
Yeah,
because we need to see that the staff of the school actually did their due diligence in order to stop this from happening.
They did. There was that one instance where the email was sent when he said his life meant nothing and they didn't respond. But everything else, I think they responded. They responded quickly, and they did everything that was within their power.
Yeah, and unless we don't have the ability to track that email or who received it. Maybe one individual, but as I think as a collective, they certainly did their due diligence.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to kind of, again, in other words, with this governmental immunity, because the school officials did do their due diligence in alerting the parents of the shooter's behavior, recommending the shooter be removed from the school, recommending the shooter be placed into counseling, they are then absolved of any further legal liability regarding the outcome, which, I don't know about you, Daniel, but I actually kind of agree with.
Yeah, I agree with it too. Like I said, there was that one little instance where there appears to have been nothing done aside from an email being sent to a counselor, but every other instance, I think they acted appropriately and like the most that they were able to do.
Yeah, now what about the parents?
So the parents were actually charged very soon after the attack with 4 counts of manslaughter, one for each of the students who...
Yeah, it's involuntary manslaughter, by the way.
Yes, thank you for correcting me. Involuntary manslaughter. They've each been charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. And as of January 20th of this year, they've remained in jail. They're accused of making the gun accessible to their son, ignoring his need for mental health treatment, breaching their responsibility by refusing to remove him from the school that day. They've both pled not guilty. And if they're convicted, which it kind of seems like the judge feels very strongly that they should be, they face 15 years in prison and a $7,500 fine for each count that they're found guilty of.
Yeah, and just to expand a little bit more on their charges, they're being charged with involuntary manslaughter due to something called gross negligence. And
was that the actual charge?
Yeah, that's the legalese. What is gross negligence? It is a lack of care that demonstrates reckless disregard for the safety or of lives of others, which is so great that it appears to be a conscious violation of other people's rights to safety. And again, this goes back to the parents' non-actions in regards to this case. So they're pleading non-guilty. I'm guessing that their plea is because they're claiming they just were unaware. But it's hard to argue that they're unaware when there's so much evidence that, they had so many red flags, they had so many warning signs. And so gross negligence is the charge behind the involuntary manslaughter. Yeah,
I agree with you, Brian. It's actually come out. The parents have an appeal. They're appealing this charge. And it actually came out in that appeal that basically the reason why they don't think that they are guilty of involuntary manslaughter is that they were not the ones who planned the shooting or pulled the trigger. That's their legal defense.
Right, which is why that gross negligence is so important to the charge. And their appeal is actually, I don't know if you read into this, but their appeal is actually because the Supreme Court of Michigan has intervened.
Oh, I didn't know the Supreme Court had gotten involved.
Yeah, so the Oakland County Circuit Court, which is the judge that did determine that there was probable cause that a crime was committed by the parents, that was actually intervened by the Supreme Court. And because of that intervention, it has moved up to the appellate court. So,
wow.
Just to kind of, if our listeners don't know the legal system in our country, there's basically three sets of courts in each state, and that is the circuit court, the appellate court, and the Supreme Court, and they do go in that order from bottom to top.
So it's made its way all the way up to the highest court in the state at this point.
Yeah, in the state. The next step would obviously be in the land, which would be the Supreme Court of the United States. I don't think it'll actually get that far. But I just kind of want to talk about what is probable cause, because that is what the appellate court is trying to determine right now. And so probable cause in layman's terms is when a person or persons have good reason to believe a crime has been or will be committed and thus need to take action to prevent that crime. So a good example, and probably the most often cited example of probable cause, is when a police officer decides to search a vehicle at a traffic stop if they believe a crime is taking place other than the traffic violation for which they performed the traffic stop to begin with. So if a person is speeding or their taillight's out or whatever, and they pull that person over, and then they notice by walking by the windows that there's also alcohol or drugs on the floor trying to be hidden, they have now probable cause to search the car because they believe a crime is either being committed or will be committed with those items. So probable cause in regards to the parents would be that they knew, they had reason to believe that a crime would be committed based on the evidence that they were given, or the red flags and the warning signs. and they chose to do nothing. And so that is what the appellate court is now trying to determine, is whether or not the parents had probable cause to intervene.
Yeah. And real quick, I just want to mention that if they are convicted of these involuntary manslaughter charges, each of them are facing a $30,000 fine and 60 years in prison. So it's basically a life sentence for each of them. They're both in their early to mid 40s.
Yeah, and the severity of that punishment is because people did lose their lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like we said before, I think they have been rightfully charged in this case.
Yeah, so that brings us to our next topic, and the reason that we actually decided to do this episode was the topic of accountability. Yeah. Who is accountable? And I kind of just want to go over a little bit what the actual term accountability means and why we're going to be diving into this. So what is accountability? The Oxford English Dictionary defines accountability as the fact or condition of being responsible. In other words, a person is held responsible for their actions. That's what it means to be accountable. So there's a lot of factors at play in regards to who should be accountable in this story. I'm just going to kind of go over my notes, and then Daniel can add if you would like to. But you have the obvious accountability of the shooter, who has already pled guilty to the crimes, and he's taking responsibility for his actions. But you also have the possible accountability of the parents, the possible accountability of the school and the workers and their legal immunity. And then you also have, what about other students or parents involved or that might have heard about the red flags that were going on? Or what about friends and family members? How do we go about determining accountability to begin with? And I just want to say that in regards to accountability as it pertains to our legal justice system here in the United States, oftentimes accountability can be very chaotic and a very long process to be able to determine who's accountable for what. But, and you know, the purpose of our podcast is to figure out, what does the Bible say about accountability? And so, are there clear lines of accountability when it comes to being a Christian? So what does the Bible say about accountability? Well, I think the first thing that we need to understand is that we're all accountable or responsible for every single sin that we commit. And that each and every one of us has sinned. I mean, Daniel, you would agree that you're a sinner, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, as am I. And I'm not proud of it, but I certainly need to admit it. We can determine that all people are sinners, and Romans 3:23 makes that very clear. It says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." So there's nobody who is not accountable for their own sin.
Yeah, just to add a few more verses to that, Romans 3 verse 10, "As it is written, there was no one righteous, not even one." Psalm 143 verse 2, "Do not bring your servant into judgment, for no one alive is righteous in your sight." Psalm 14:3, "There is no one who does good, not even one."
Right, and that's all actually verses that Paul is referencing in those Romans passages, right? Yeah, and then, so that, you know, we've determined that everybody sins, nobody does good, nobody seeks after God, and so we're all accountable to our own sins, to our own actions. But what does it mean to sin? I think this is a really important distinction to make. Romans 3:20 gives us some insight. It says, "For no one will be justified in his sight is God's sight, by the works of the law, because the knowledge of sin comes through the law." So what does that mean? It means that anything that is in opposition to God's moral law is considered sin. So anytime we do anything that is against God's moral law, we are committing sin. So when you think about it, right, that concept of accountability needs to be on the forefront of our minds when we're not doing things that are in conjunction with God's moral law.
Yeah, and just one more verse to add there. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, he says, "Everyone who commits sin practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness." So, you know, through those two verses that we quoted, Romans 3:20, 1 John 3:4, we see that sin is any rebellion against God's moral law.
Yeah, absolutely. And so why is it important to understand sin as it pertains to accountability? Well, when we sin, when we do something that is in opposition to God's moral law, we are responsible for those actions. Whether in our own society or not, right? God's moral standard is the epitome of moral law. And so we have to understand that every time we do anything that is in opposition to God's moral law, we need to hold ourselves accountable for that. If somebody is listening to this podcast who is not a Christian or maybe has not yet submitted their life to Jesus Christ as their Lord, you might be asking why we consider God's moral law our standard. And I just want to cite Romans 9:20 and 21 to answer this question. It says this: "Will what is formed say to the one who formed it, 'Why did you make me like this?' Or has the potter no right over the clay?" And this is very important because as Christians, we believe that because we are created by God, then we are also subject to God for our moral standard. So everything is subject to God's moral standard. He's the creator. He's the one who designed, who made, implemented everything. It was for him, by him, through him.
Yeah.
And so we need to understand that when we are in opposition to him, then we are responsible for those actions, and we actually do stand guilty before him. And the reason I use the term guilty here is because I do believe that there is a similarity to a courtroom scenario when it comes to our standing before God. God is our judge. He's the one who will determine whether or not we're guilty or innocent. And so when we sin, when we do things that are outside of his moral standard, we stand guilty before him. And so we, again, have to take responsibility. We are accountable. Therefore, in regards to personal sin or sin that we have committed, we are all accountable to it, and we are all guilty for it. Do you have anything to add on that, Daniel?
I mean, just as far, like you mentioned, it's kind of similar to our court system today. I think it's in Colossians or Galatians, Paul refers to our sin as the record of debt that stands against us. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Again, like he's using legal language there.
Yeah, and so how do we obey God's moral law? How do we know what that is, and how do we determine whether or not we're accountable? Well, all the moral law of God, as stated in Matthew 22:37 through 40, is summed up in the two greatest commandments. And I'll just read this: is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. So that's the greatest and most important commandment. The second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets depend on these two commands. So if we were to kind of break that apart a little bit, what we need to understand is that we would live by the standards of God because we love him. We love him with all of our heart, soul, and mind. And so everything we do, all of our motivations, all of our intentions need to be formed by our love for God. That is the very first commandment for all Christians. And so that is our accountability. If we are living outside of our love for God, then we will be guilty before him. And the reason why it's the second greatest commandment is because how are we supposed to treat each other? We're supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves. We wouldn't treat other people, or we shouldn't treat other people as less than we would treat ourselves. So in regards to this particular story, we would never out of malice or hatred, end our own lives, or we shouldn't do that. And so we shouldn't do that to other people as well. All of the law and the prophets depend on these two commands. Anything outside of these two things is considered sin.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to how we should go about loving others, Paul actually says in Galatians 6, verse 1 and 2, brothers and sisters, if someone is overtaken in any wrongdoing, you who are spiritual, restore such a person with a gentle spirit. So, right there, what Paul's basically saying is that believers have a moral responsibility before God to confront sin that we see in fellow believers and make every effort to restore them to a right relationship with God and from that sin.
Absolutely. But what about accountability when it applies to other people? And this is, in regards to this story, this is what would, be applicable to the parents and the school and the staff and things like that. So what about accountability when it applies to other people? Leviticus 5:1 does shed some light on this subject, and it says this: if he has seen, and this is just any individual, if he has seen, heard, or known about something that he has witnessed and did not respond to a public call to testify, he will bear his iniquity. In other words, if we witness sinful behavior, or even behavior that could lead to sin, and we are called to bear witness to that behavior, and we do not act, or if we lie about it, that action on our part is considered sin before God. It is the sin of bearing false witness, the 9th commandment. And so these parents had a biblical obligation to notify when they did see behavior that could lead to sin or even sinful behavior in and of itself. the school, again, same thing. All these people would be under this same standard of being called to testify, being called to bear witness about actions or events or red flags or warning signs about a sin that may occur or is occurring, and they have a moral obligation to respond to these things. So as Christians, we are under this moral obligation, and we should be responding to these things. In regards to parents and children specifically, because again, this has to do with parents and children, there's several verses that I kind of want to go over, and one of them is Ephesians 6:4. Fathers, do not stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. So it's the responsibility of Christian parents to train them up in the ways of the Lord, which means that we also need to be aware of things that are in opposition to God. Now, I don't want to get too far into this, or even very far into this, but again, if we have a child who is experiencing spiritual warfare, as I believe this person probably was, then it's our obligation as parents to then raise them in the ways of the Lord, find out what's going on, help them figure that out, maybe even pray against it. Deuteronomy 4:9. Only be on your guard and diligently watch yourselves, so that you don't forget the things your eyes have seen, and so that they don't slip from your mind as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to your grandchildren. Again, we have a Christian and moral obligation to teach our children the ways of God and the ways of the Lord as Christians. So we definitely need to step up in those realms. Don't rely on other people or institutions. Don't rely on church congregations or preachers, Sunday school teachers, what have you. It is parents' responsibility to teach their children the ways of the Lord. And then just one more verse to talk about in regards to family and relatives is 1 Timothy 5:8. But if anyone does not provide for his family, especially for his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And the reason that I actually brought this passage into it is because when we read this passage, most of the time we think about the necessities for life, shelter, clothing, food, and water. But I want to say that I believe this can actually be expanded to mental health and health in general. If we have the ability to provide for our family members and our own household, and we deny them that help, that assistance, that healing, then I do believe that we are acting in bad faith and that we are worse than an unbeliever. And in this regard, his parents really should have gotten him counseling and healing for what he was going through. Would you agree, Daniel?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you there.
Yeah, so again, parents to children, family or relatives, just in general, in concern with accountability, these are all things that I believe the Bible is clear on, and that I do believe are topics that we can relate to this story. Before we close, did you have anything else you wanted to add, Daniel?
Well, you mentioned earlier something about spiritual warfare. Did you want to just kind of explain briefly what that might be?
Yeah, I don't have the passage in front of me, but we as Christians are in spiritual warfare. We do fight against the powers of the spiritual realm, and so that goes into the armor of God. And this is actually, we talked about this in our in our Ukraine war episodes. But the idea is that we fight a battle on a spiritual front, and hearing what Daniel mentioned earlier about what this young person was seeing and hearing previous to the mass shooting, to me there's definitely some elements of possible spiritual warfare here. And so I don't know the faith of the family, I don't know the faith of the parents, I don't know the faith of the child, but what I do know is that would be very alarming to me as if I were a parent and it was my child. That would be something that would just be very, very alarming, and something that I would want to combat strongly.
Yeah, I agree with you. We don't know the hearts of any of the people involved with this attack with regard to their faith in God, but man, everything that happened preceding the shooting, kind of understanding the state of mind that this kid was in, it's very clear that he was a very mentally disturbed individual, and he needed help, and he wasn't getting it.
Yeah, and I think that there's help out there. There's help to be had, and he was denied that help.
Especially, I know we keep saying this, but in today's world, it is I don't think it's very difficult to get mental health counseling.
Especially if you have these red flags. I mean, this is something that we're hypersensitive to in our society right now.
Yeah.
So there's definitely options out there. There's school resources. I mean, there's all kinds of things. So anyway, in conclusion, just to kind of recap the episode and the biblical truths in regards to the episode, in regards to the shooter, he violated the sixth commandment: do not murder. His guilty plea is a correct plea, and regardless of whether or not he's a Christian, he is doing the right thing here, because he did commit a crime and he violated the sixth commandment. I do want to say really quick, because it does sound like we're kind of being judgy, and I don't want to be judgy. What I will say is that these statements in regards to biblical responses really do apply to Christians. And since we don't know the spiritual condition of any of the parties involved, this is a episode on how Christians should respond to these events.
Yeah, and like you mentioned earlier, Brian, according to Romans 9, this is the reason why we believe God's moral law is the standard and why we live by it. Because we're Christians, we don't see any other way fit to live by other than God's moral law.
Right. So just to kind of continue on, in regards to the school and staff, they did fulfill the obligation of Leviticus 5:1, and they did notify the parents of the shooter's behavior. Biblically, they are not accountable for the shooter's actions. They did their due diligence.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
And then in regards to the parents, not only are they in violation of Leviticus 5:1, since they took no action in regards to their child's behavior, they are also biblically accountable for not raising their child in the ways of the Lord. And again, this is not to say that we want to be judgy or judge them for that. We just want to say that if we are Christians, if you're listening right now and you're a Christian, then you do have a responsibility to raise your child in the way of the Lord. And then lastly, they did not provide for their child the necessary mental health resources required to heal their son in the way that he needed. And so to me, they are also accountable in regards to 1 Timothy 5:8.
Yeah, there's one other person or persons. I mentioned that video that he sent to at least one person where, he said he had access to a gun and said it's time to shoot up the school, JK. I think that person should have at least said something. I'm unable to verify if they notified anyone prior to the shooting of that text or not. I want to make that very clear. But I would say if anyone does find themselves in that situation and they're a fellow student, at a minimum, you should tell your parents about what this person sent you, and then your parents can take that to the school board and you can let the authorities deal with it appropriately. Yeah,
absolutely. In fact, I would just encourage further that if you are a student, a young person in a school today, and you're a believer, it is your moral obligation to report these things. You would be in violation of biblical text. And so I just want to encourage you to notify whoever needs to be notified. And not only for the moral obligation, but also just because, you want to try to save lives if you can.
Absolutely. I would hate to feel like, I had some sort of responsibility if I didn't say anything.
Yeah. So even if you're not a believer and you're a high school student or a young person today, do it for the sake of everybody around you.
Yeah.
It is a Christian's responsibility before God to provide an honest and sincere report when questioned or confronted about ongoing sin or possible sin. Raise children in the ways of the Lord. Provide the necessary resources for family in need. And that's all I have to say. Anything else, Daniel?
No, I think that's going to do it for this episode. So, as always, Brian and I thank you, each of you, for listening to this episode of the Bible Speaks podcast. Please feel free to send us suggestions for news stories to the Bible Speaks podcast at gmail.com. And if you could leave reviews, share the episodes, and subscribe to the podcast, we would greatly appreciate it. Again, we thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.